Another conflict that occurred in the 18th century had to do with control over the slave trade. So the Europeans all brought with them a culture that utilized slavery, and the natives got wrapped up in that, either as slave traders themselves or taken as slaves. So the English established the colony of South Carolina in 1670. And who worked with them in South Carolina were a group called the Westos. And this was an interesting group since it had been a refugee group of about 4,000 that had been displaced by the Beaver Wars in the Great Lakes. They were technically Erie natives, and calling themselves the Westos by 1670, and they worked with the English. As a result, they got access to English weapons, and with those weapons, they were able to more effectively capture slaves and then sell them to the English and sell them all over. By the 18th century, they had upset the English because they were trading with other Europeans for slaves, and the English turned on them. They cut off their trade with the Westos and started trading with a group called the Savannahs, who were also a Beaver War refugee group. And the Savannahs then captured most of the Westos and sold them as slaves to the English. At that point, the Savannahs and another group called the Yamasee started working together, and they ended up capturing many slaves in the region and then selling them to other Europeans. By the 17 teens, though, what they all found was that they had exhausted the supply of native captives to use for slaves, and the English started turning on them. And so at that point, the Yamasee started fighting back against the English, and they had quite a number of allies, including the Creeks and Choctaws and Cherokees. Those were all new groupings that would eventually become known of as the Five Civilized Tribes, and they were reconstituted groups of the various confederacies that had once existed and were displaced by the Spanish attacks and then disease, and then movement of various migrant movements and refugee movements as a result of European influence. And so there was just this turmoil throughout this entire period in the early 18th century as a result of European meddling. And the Europeans were trying their best to control North America and also compete with each other over access. And so this area here was kind of in the crossroads of the English and Spanish claims, and there were some French as well. So there was a lot of meeting. I don't want to say meeting, it was competition and could turn violent between the competing empires, and natives were part of that struggle. The Yamasees found themselves mistreated and crowded out by the expanding colonists in South Carolina. They lived in the coastal plain, which was really good rice-growing territory, which the English eventually wanted. And so the Yamasees became less convenient for them. The English wanted to expand their plantations, expand their livestock, grazing areas, and so forth. So the Yamasees allied with some of those southern confederacies now against the English to try to fight back against them. And this was a pretty big reversal since they had been trading with the English with slaves for some time. But the ensuing conflict became known of as the Yamasee War and went on for a couple years. And it actually looked like it was going to tear South Carolina apart. Again, this was kind of a King Philip's War-like situation in which the colonists were not sure the colony was going to survive. The Yamasees won a lot of the early battles in particular. So by the after the first few months of the war, they had killed about 400 colonists and driven a lot of colonists from their farms and plantations. The tide turned against the Yamassees when the Cherokee unexpectedly entered the war against the Creeks, and that deprived the Yamassees of their most powerful allies. So the Creeks here, these are reconstitutions of the various Muskogeans, Mississippians. The Cherokee decided to attack them, and that meant the Creek could no longer help the Yamasee fight the English that were over there along the coast. So, with the support of the Cherokee and the Iroquois, who had adopted a group called the Tuscarora, who lived in what's now North Carolina, and they were also Tuscarora refugees, also of the Beaver Wars, and they had moved to this area, and the Iroquois adopted them as what they called their Sixth Nation. Using those Indian allies, the English were able to push back against the Yamassees and defeat them. And part of that defeat meant enslaving many of them, if not most of them. So between the 1670s and 1720s, as the Carolinas were developing, the human toll on the native communities was intense. Historians have looked at the records to try to figure out how many slaves were bought and sold. And from what they can tell, the slave trade caused the native population to decline by as much as 2/3 in this, what became Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina area. Combined with that fighting over slaves was competition for trade, which caused fighting among the natives, and also, as always, affected them. Disease and health-related problems, again, exacerbated by the slavery. So the natives who became slaves, they got dispersed in all directions, either sold to the Caribbean, some of them sold north, some of them sold to whatever plantations were available to purchase them. So this was all part of the various colonial competition. Again, you wanted slaves for your plantations so you could produce more goods, so you could be economically dominant over the Atlantic trade, and the natives were all wrapped up into this. And so there were several flashpoints of conflict. One of them was this Carolina borderlands and what became Georgia, and another area of contention was this frontier of Pennsylvania and Virginia. All of these areas had seen massive refugee movements from the displacements that occurred from the Beaver Wars and so forth. The French continued to move down the Mississippi, establishing outposts. Spanish were still in Florida with missions, and they had some missions in Texas, and obviously there's Santa Fe over here. And then the English colonies continued to grow, and this was all part of this intense rivalry to control North America, of which the natives were both victims of this competition and participants in it. They would make alliances with themselves, with the Europeans, in order to try to get the best deal for themselves. So the control of North America, this blue, again, colonization of the map, all these forts that the French built, they staffed these forts with relatively few people, and in order for them to run, they obviously had to have the cooperation of the Native Americans. And who was out in that region were a number of, like I said before, refugee groups from the Beaver Wars. A lot of the remnants of the people who had been displaced moved south and all over the place. So the French, as they met with these people, had no way of coercing them to trade. So both the French and the natives needed each other for trade. They also needed each other to protect against the Iroquois, who were trying to expand themselves. It's not just the French, English, and Spanish all having a rivalry here. It's also the Iroquois who considered themselves an empire, the Six Nations now. And that Sixth Nation was an expansion down into Carolina. So they kind of, again, colonization of the map. The Virginia was way over here on the seaboard, and you've got the Iroquois reaching all the way around them and claiming to be part of a kingdom because of the Tuscaroras down here. So the Iroquois were the largest military power among any of the native groups in the northern part of North America, or mid-Atlantic part, and the French didn't have that many troops or people or colonists, and a lot of these refugee groups were in population decline, and so they kind of needed each other, and created what one historian named Richard White has called the middle ground. And this is an interesting phenomenon, and it was kind of the state of affairs that existed prior to the explosion of worldwide wars between the Europeans, in which North America was one of the theaters. Before that, ironically enough, there were a bunch of forts. These forts were generally peaceful and defensive in nature. And at these forts, what Richard White said occurred between the French and the various natives who lived in what's now kind of the upper Midwest of the United States, so Great Lakes region and Mississippi River area. What existed was what he called a middle ground. And the middle ground was not necessarily an actual middle ground. What Richard White said was that people didn't share their values. They created new ones through misinterpretations. They misinterpreted each other's cultures and values, and through those misunderstandings, there was a new kind of society created that had shared meanings and new practices. So it created an interesting kind of peace in which natives became more like the Europeans and Europeans became more like the natives. And this was more possible with the French because they had so fewer colonists that they sent, and the French didn't invest a lot, but they were making a lot of money off the fur trade, which they wanted to continue to control. So an example of how both cultures could be changed in the middle ground towns, which were around these forts. And these forts are all spread up and down Mississippi and St. Lawrence rivers and Great Lakes. There was a woman named Marie Ruenza. She was an Illinois native. Illinois is named after a tribe that lived in that area. And her father was a sachem of the Illinois natives, and he wanted to create good trade relationships with the French, and so he offered to marry off his daughter, who her French version of her name was Marie, and she was 17 years old, offered to marry her to a French trader. And Marie actually objected to the marriage. She did not want it because she thought that this French trader was going to use her and sexually abuse her. What she had actually converted to Christianity, and the Jesuit missionaries, the French Catholic missionaries, Jesuits who of the Jesuit order, who converted her, she listened to them and believed them that this man that her dad was trying to marry off to was, quote unquote, a libertine. In other words, a sexually lascivious person who may abuse her. And so she refused to marry him. She had this fight with her father about it. He wanted to force her to marry him so he could get the trade going with the French trader. And she went to the Jesuit priests and said, hey, I need help here. I need support. What my father's trying to make me do. And they actually intervened with the parents and worked out a mediation in which the parents promised that they would become baptized, as well as the trader, and the French trader would be baptized, maybe again, all as Catholics. That way, I guess they would all be the same religion, and it was okay. So that's an example of the kind of concessions that would happen in the middle ground, where you had these competing and mixing of cultures. Historians tend to look at this and think, kind of like one of the videos said, what a multicultural diversity fest this was. And it really wasn't. It's something that we kind of like to build up as examples of people living together in these multicultural situations, but in reality, it was actually very tense and very anxious, and neither the natives nor the Europeans actually liked the middle ground. It was something that bothered them, and they wanted to change, and it definitely would change when conflict got worse and there were changes of control over that middle part of North America.